Hello and welcome to the Mountain West Archive, a podcast where we discuss books about life and culture in the Rocky Mountain West. Today we're going to introduce Ted Conover's book, Cheap Land, Colorado, Off-Gridders at America's Edge. In this episode, we discuss what this book is about, why I think it's interesting, and my reflection on Conover's overall body of work. If you would like to support the podcast, please subscribe to the channel and find affiliate links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining me on this introduction to Ted Conover's book, Cheap Land, Colorado. This book is about the author's time in the San Luis Valley, where he works for a group running a homeless shelter in the biggest town of the region, with a county population of about 16,000. He volunteers with their Rural Outreach Initiative, the arm that tries to keep the valley's residents from becoming homeless. So he would go to these people out in the middle of nowhere and approach them to ask if they needed firewood, clothes, food, and stuff like that. And in the process, if he got to know them, if the opportunity seemed right, he would tell them about his project and ask if he could interview them. And through these conversations, we get an insight into their lives and this world of off-grid living in the San Luis Valley. I find this book interesting because, to outsiders, Colorado is this exotic location with mountain views, ski resorts, and high property values, which is all mostly true, but San Luis Valley is not that Colorado. The land here is cheap because it has no utilities. Roads are unpaved and there are no medical services to speak of. People here live off-grid, most of them in trailer homes, and residents with criminal backgrounds are not uncommon. They move to the valley to sort of escape their past and make a fresh start. Move someplace where they can own a piece of land, live on very little, and find a sense of freedom in that austerity. In a sense, this book is a cultural commentary, a perspective on American society by looking at its fringes. In this, it is not dissimilar from Jessica Bruder's book, Nomadland, where she writes about older Americans adopting transient lifestyles in search for seasonal work. But whereas Nomadland deals with the subculture of American retirees that move around the country, chasing favorable climate, Cheap Land, Colorado is set in a very specific place and about people who wish to be rooted to it. It is about their successes and failings in doing so. To me, these books, both Nomadland and Cheap Land, Colorado, are ultimately about hope and possibility. About possibility of a better future and the avenues this country makes available to those who have found themselves on the wrong side of luck for far too long. This relationship is fraught with conflict, of course. Even as the country makes these opportunities available, it doesn't make them easy to pursue. The book does a great job uncovering challenges faced by the prairie dwellers in becoming longtime residents of the valley. The writing in this book isn't strictly journalistic. Ted does not like to be an outside observer looking at people's lives and commenting on them with some sort of objective viewpoint. No, he likes to do what has come to be known as immersion writing. He inhabits the role of a prairie dweller, living with them, and writes about his experience of the place and people around him. He wants to be one of them, write about their struggles, triumphs, and the insights these reveal to him, which doesn't fit the frame of ethnography or anthropology, both of which call on the observer to be dispassionate, uninvolved, and not a participant in the story. Over time, he develops a fondness for life in the valley and ends up buying his own plot. "I like who I am there," he says in an interview. You see this trend of immersion writing in his other books as well. The first book he ever published was called Rolling Nowhere, Riding the Rails with America's Hobos. The book is based on his undergrad research on the life and travel experiences of the 1980s railroad hobos in western United States. As a student in Amherst College in Massachusetts, Ted was fascinated by books he read about railroad hobos and wanted to write a thesis on their lifestyle and experiences. His advisors thought this idea was risky, so he was forced to take a break from college from August to December 1980, so the fall semester. He took the semester off to immerse himself in the hobo subculture. From the notes he took during those months, he wrote a senior thesis titled Between Freedom and Poverty: Railroad Tramps of American West. Rolling Nowhere is based on this thesis. It was published in 1984 when Ted was only 26 years old. In 1987, Ted published his second book titled Coyotes: A Journey Across Borders with America's Mexican Migrants. This book is based on his travels, seasonal labor stints, and participatory journalism research with Mexican migrant workers in the late 1980s. The book was written at a time when American political stances on Mexican migrant workers were becoming very polarized. The Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed in 1986, which decreased illegal migration for a few years, but the figure went back up in the 90s. The book still feels very relevant. After the publication of his first couple of books, Ted met a smart guy in New York who once introduced him at a party as a writer who made a living sleeping on the ground, which got him worried and led him to Aspen and Whiteout, a very different sort of first-person account. Whiteout is about the rich and narcissistic upper class in Aspen, as well as some real people, Ted writes on his website. Then, in 2000, he published New Jack, Guarding Sing Sing. He spent a year working as a corrections officer at New York's Sing Sing Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison for men. There, he worked shifts in which he alone supervised scores of violent inner-city felons. New Jack is his account of that experience. In the book, he tells the story of a harsh, hidden world and that dramatizes the conflict between the necessity to isolate criminals and the dehumanization of guards as well as inmates that almost inevitably takes place behind bars. In 2010, The Routes of Man, Travels in a Paved World was published. In this book, Ted explores the impact of 6 key paved routes across the world in Peru, East Africa, China, Nigeria, the Himalayas, and the West Bank. En route, he addresses some of the world's most pressing issues, from the spread of AIDS by truckers in East Africa to smuggling along Peruvian highways. Throughout, we see Conover's remarkable ease with language, his infectious enthusiasm, and deep humanity. And then, after using this technique of immersion in his writing for so long, in 2016, he publishes a book called Immersion, A Writer's Guide to Going Deep. In immersion reporting, a literary cousin to ethnography, travel writing, and memoir, the writer steps into a new world or culture, participating in its trials, rites, and rituals as a member of the group. In this book, he distills decades of knowledge into an accessible resource aimed at writers of all levels. He covers how to get into a community, how to conduct oneself once inside, and how to shape and structure the stories that emerge. Looking at the list of these books, his overall body of work, I think Ted is fascinated by worlds on the margins of our cultural awareness and is attracted to dangers they entail. And I think this fascination has a lot to do with the cultural significance of the idea of frontier West in American consciousness, the mythical call to explore and conquer the unknown. In this book, he writes, "It's not hard to see a through line between the homesteaders of the 19th century and the people who move out there today. The land is no longer free, but it is some of the cheapest in the United States. In many respects, a person could live in this vast, empty space like the pioneers did in the Great Plains, except you'd have a truck instead of a wagon and a mule, and some solar panels, possibly even a weak cell phone signal, and legal weed. By selling or bartering weed and picking up seasonal labor, you might even get by without having a job, though if you have no income, things can get tricky, especially when winter comes around. It would be extremely difficult to live completely off the land, especially out on the open prairie." The pioneers in Conover's story come to the valley with modest ambitions, to live on their own land without being bothered and to have a better future. Conover is attracted to this sense of hope in the future. It is something they have in common with the pioneers who pushed the frontier. it isn't one of these pessimistic rural American places where the best seems in the past. Rather, the San Luis Valley seems to be a place brimming with possibility, Conover says in an interview with Nicholas Hunt. He continues, I feel my spirit open up when I come over the pass and see myself entering this vast volume of space defined by the two mountain ranges. This isn't to say Conover is under any delusions about life in the San Luis Valley. When Nicholas Hunt questions Conover about the post-apocalyptic world of Mad Max metaphor he uses in the book, Conover responds, I stick by the Mad Max metaphor because it's just so apt for the area in which I live down there. Occasionally, you'll see the wooden ruins of a log cabin from some old homestead, but much more common are the aluminum and plastic ruins of trashed RVs. Maybe it's less beautiful, but to me it's more honest. It's a truer reflection of where we are today. It's the rural West, and it's got the frontier spirit still, but it's also got paranoia and the fearfulness of what's happening in the world. Now that we have some context of Ted's overall body of work and my thoughts on it, I want to delve into the book. In this episode, I will only discuss the prologue, and we will delve deeper into the chapters in the coming weeks. In the prologue, Ted gives us a peek into how the rural outreach work for the Rural Outreach Initiative of La Puente is actually done. La Puente is the name of the organization he's working for. It starts with Matt, to whom Ted is an understudy, driving him around in his pickup truck so Ted can see him in action. Then Ted recounts a few encounters he has with prairie dwellers when he is doing outreach work on his own. The average lot size in the open prairie is about 5 acres, which means distances between houses are great. This allows Matt, a 49-year-old veteran of 2 tours in Iraq, to explain his approach. Before you even make contact, you must consider the visual impression you're going to make on the people around you. He tells Ted not to wear a blue shirt because that's the color worn by the Costilla County Code Enforcement. And this is important because the county code enforcement has been giving prairie dwellers some trouble over the absence of septic system on their properties. If they think you're from the code enforcement, they will not come out to meet you. So Matt usually wears a hoodie or a polo shirt with La Puente's insignia on it, so people know that he is, not from the code enforcement and not to be worried about him. After he decides the dwelling that he wants to make contact with, he sort of drives by the place a few times before actually stopping to get to know the place and what's around it. He looks for signs that can tell him what to expect. An American flag suggests a firearm inside. Is there an area hidden behind the fence that suggests pot being grown? He's also looking for signs of life, fresh tire tracks or smoke from the chimney, because a lot of dwellings in the valley are abandoned, and many only lived in during the summer. And this is a theme that will come in the book later as well, how a lot of people move into the valley during the summer. They love the warm weather, they get used to being there, but then they don't expect how cold it's going to get in the winter. And then when it really gets cold, that is when they sort of have to abandon their homes, maybe move to the homeless shelter or figure something else out. And on these trips, normally you didn't see somebody outside. So the procedure was to stop at the end of the driveway and tap the horn. At the first sign of life, he would step out of the truck so they could see him. And you would leave them with some firewood, a business card with his cell number in case they ever find themselves needing food, clothing, or a ride to town for a doctor's appointment. After riding around with Matt for a while, after Ted has picked up a few skills and is confident about doing this on his own, he sets himself a goal of 3 new contacts per day. So the goal is to drive up to a place, make sure it is safe, and meet the people living there. The organization he is volunteering for, La Puente, is a non-profit working with a very small budget, so they cannot afford to give him a truck for the job. So they loan him a rural outreach sign, which he puts on the door of his own pickup truck. So as he drives around, as he drives up to places, the hope is people will see the sign, know that he is not from the code enforcement, and they will be more welcoming and sort of, not be threatened by him. The prologue of this book discusses 3 different encounters Ted has as he is doing this rural outreach work in the valley. We don't actually know whether these are the first three encounters he has or if they're even in chronological order, but these are sort of picked as our introduction into the world of San Luis Valley. The first encounter, he is driving around for a while and settles on a place with a short driveway, which would make him harder to ignore and easier to evaluate. From the tracks in the dirt, he understands that someone has been driving in and out, then notices somebody in the Jeep in front of him. So there's a car right in front of him, and then as he's assessing everything around him, he notices there's someone in the car. So he walks out, introduces himself to the guy who is wearing a Corona beer baseball cap and tells him about the firewood, which the guy refuses. He informs Ted he'd just returned from rehab for an opioid addiction and offers him a Sprite, but doesn't invite him in the car. This was November, right? So it is cold outside, it's a bit windy. Ted is caught standing outside in the wind with a cold can of Sprite in his hand, talking to a guy sitting in the comfort of his car in a t-shirt that reads "single and ready to jingle." So he probably has heat on inside his car. He's nice and warm, toasty. He's sitting comfortably, and Ted is standing outside in the wind with a cold can of Sprite. But luckily for Ted, this guy is really chatty, so he doesn't have to pry any information, ask a lot of questions. He just starts talking and is very open about himself and about his life. So he tells him about this one time when he was away and he let someone live on his property, and then when he came back, he got into an argument with the guy and the guy shot him. He tells him the story and then raises his sleeve to show a big complicated scar on his arm. Next encounter the book talks about is when Ted is driving around for a while trying to make contact and ends up outside a place close to the road with a horse and a few chicken. There he stops and honks. A few moments later, a Hispanic guy in his 60s approaches him from inside the property. And while he is walking, Ted notices a cease and desist letter from the county stapled to the fence post. He asks the guy if they're after him about the no septic system that they're trying to get everyone for. But he says no, it's about taxes. Ted offers him wood, as was his standard practice, which the guy accepts, and tells Ted about the 10 hours of community service he owes to a court, and asks if he could work it off with La Puente. Ted is new at this whole rural outreach thing, so he just gives the man a phone number to the office and asks him to give them a call. Then he gets back into his truck to leave, and when he turns the key, nothing. He finds out the battery is dead. Embarrassed, he taps the horn once again. The man comes out immediately and offers to give him a jump. In the final contact recounted in the prologue, he sees a bunch of old vehicles on a large property, a Lincoln, an RV, a pickup truck, a Volkswagen bus, and an SUV arranged in roughly 3/4 of a circle. But the house was about a football field away from the road, and Ted figures there's no point in honking from out on the street because they wouldn't hear him, so he decides to drive in. He honks a couple times as he approaches and parks his truck in the circle. Then he lowers the windows so he is easier to spot. Then a middle-aged white man comes out of the door wearing a baseball cap, walks around the side of the truck. He doesn't know who Ted is, so he's scoping him out, just like Ted would scope out a place before entering. The man kept his right hand inside his pocket of the hoodie, which probably meant he was carrying a gun. He asks Ted, "How you doing?" in a way that said, "Declare yourself." Ted tells him he is from La Puente, like he always does, and offers him some firewood. He interrupts Ted and says, "That's dangerous, just rolling up on people. You must be either brave or a little dumb." "Probably a little dumb," Ted responds. He tells Ted he was just visiting from California and that Tony will be back a little later. As it turns out, the place belonged to a guy called Tyrod Tony, who was someone Ted had already met. Ted writes, "I was no longer afraid, but I was a little wistful, feeling like a cat who had wasted one of her 9 lives." I think he is wistful because somewhere in his heart he believes there's only so many dumb things he can get away with without getting shot, and he has just wasted one of those chances at the property of a person he already knew. And with that ends the prologue. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below with your thoughts and let me know what you would like to listen to in the future. I'll see you in the next one.